Welcome, everyone. My name is Dana White. Welcome to an extremely special Myth Salon today. I've been after Dyane Sherwood for probably 15 or more years. I originally wanted to go to her workshop on the Splendor Solis in 2004. I thought, gee, they'll do it again. I can't do it this weekend, but they'll do it. And she never did it again. And she left Woodside and went back to Ohio and never to be found again. And then I resurrected the Splendor Solis, and she wasn't terribly responsive because, like a lot of us, she had moved on in her life to other things. And I said, yeah, but you got to do this. You got to do this. This is a really cool thing. So I am so grateful, Dyane, that you said yes to the Splendor Solis. I love the manuscript. I met Jörg Vollnagel out at the Getty during the alchemy symposium that they had a few years ago. And today, we are very privileged to have David Brafman with us, who coordinates that and all the other wonderful things that they have going on related to this sort of material at the Getty. What a special afternoon we're in for. So I would like to slow things down a little bit, and let's take note of the world that we are now living in. Right now, the Myth Salon came into being at the beginning of the pandemic, and 750,000 people have lost their lives, in America alone, through this coronavirus. And so, as I do opening every Myth Salon, I would like us just to pause a moment, just to allow us to imagine what we have and what we have lost. So let's do a moment of silence, please. Nothing could really be more appropriate than William Butler Yeats' incredible poem, The Second Coming. Turning and turning the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly those words are out when a vast image of the Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun is moving its slow thighs, while all about it real shadows of indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again. But now, I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmares by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast in our come round at last slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. So I think of the context of the Splendor Solis, the 16th century. And what we have is this amazing tension between the pagan cultures that had brought humanity to that point and the Christian cultures that had inserted themselves into humanity and were now making claim upon the world. This is tension. They're looking at how do they keep the vernal equinox in line with Easter? And for those who believed it, there was a natural affiliation between Easter and the vernal equinox, but it had slipped past. It was moving further and further away every year, 11 minutes. Can you imagine introducing a brand new calendar into a European culture? It would have taken years for recognition to begin with. The Julian calendar started off with 365 days and 6 hours, but they came around to find out that it was 365 days, 5 hours, and about 45 minutes. That's a problem because this synchrony between the holiday and the sun were going by the wayside. So they brought in this brand new calendar in the same year that the Splendor Solis came out, 1582. So here we are, once again, caught up in an age of polarization. These are profound times. This is a profound document. There is so much symbolism buried in all of the 22 frames of the Splendor Solis. And I'm deeply honored that Dyane Sherwood would have said yes when I asked her to come in here and be with us to do this. So with that, I'd like to turn it over now to my very good friend, Will Linn, my partner and colleague and founder of the Myth Salon. 5 years ago, we came up with this. And here we are. What a wonderful afternoon we have in store for us. So Will, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dana. And actually that day that you came and had that conversation with me about getting this started, you came down to the studio, LA Center Studios, where my school is. And this is the first Myth Salon that I'm recording from there, from here. And the reason I'm doing it is, of course, because of this painting behind me, The Alchemist, a family painting, very, very relevant to today. So thanks for the full circle as we talk about calendars. As we get started, I just want to remember that we've had some amazing events on alchemy in the past. We've had Charles Zeltzer come and talk with us about alchemy. Christophe Lemuel came and talked with us about alchemy and the Red Book and synchronicity. And then one of our good friends, John Booker, we've talked about, just put out a book on the Emerald Tablet and a graphic novel on the Emerald Tablet. And then at the beginning of this session, as y'all were coming in, we shared a video that Mythology Channel created from a trip to Prague. So alchemy has been a recurring conversation. And I just wanted to take a second. Some of us, this may seem foreign to some of us, if you're a psychologist or a mythologist, or if you're into magic and the esoteric, maybe it's obvious, maybe you're already on the wavelength of why alchemy. But if you're an artist or a screenwriter and you're here, for the first time for an alchemy event, what is this about? And I just thought I'd mention that we study alchemy for very similar reasons that we study dream. We study dream and alchemy because both are very much about the transmutation of inner experience into a symbolic sequence of some kind. And so we look at a good alchemical recipe is not unlike a good dream. Both are allegories or both are symbolic processes that by the end of them should have transformed the alchemist or the dreamer who's engaging in them. So if you are a psychologist looking to support healing, or if you're an esoteric researcher trying to make sense of these traditions, or if you're just a storyteller or an artist trying to work with imagery that is psychological, that's some of the stuff that we really want to get into tonight. So it's my honor, of course, to introduce everybody here. And as many of you saw, our panel just grew in real time. So makes me think of another very special stone, the stone of stone soup, right? The stone that once you start throwing it in the soup, more stuff starts to grow, more stuff starts to come. So thank you to everybody who's joined us last minute. And y'all, I hope will, I'm going to go around and add a couple of these new bios, not in the same place that some of the others are. So you all know Dr. Dana White, scholar, author, host of this Myth Salon, and contributing faculty at Pacifica Graduate Institute. He's recently finished his Dow project, which I hope you guys have checked out. My name is Will Linn. I'm founder of Myth House and the General Education Department here at Husson College, where I teach filmmakers and performing artists. We're here with panelists tonight. You know, Dr. Dennis Patrick Slattery is a regular with us. He's a mythologist, scholar, poet, longtime professor at Pacifica's Myth program, author of An Obscure Order, but also author of the new work, The Way of Myth. So I hope you guys will check that out. Joining us on the panel as well, some of you may know, remember Sophie Dufresne, who gave a Myth Salon back in Dana's living room. So this is a throwback to that event. And here I'll share this link with you once I pause. But Sophie is an independent artist offering services in illustration, painting, graphic design, and animation, who also markets and sells products such as notebooks, prints, accessories, embellished with their own designs. She's about to complete this. We met her through the certificate program. This is a good throwback at the Jungian Studies program in LA that we collaborated with Christophe Lemuel on and ran down here on this campus at LA Center Studios. She brings her artistic approach, a healthy spirit of scientific curiosity and playful logic, coupled with rigorous research she inherited from her studies in engineering and mathematics at Montreal Polytechnic in Virginia Tech. So I know that's a last minute bio, and I'm sure it's been updated since then, Sophie, but thank you for being with us. Dr. Gus Cwik, who is a clinical psychologist, hypnotherapist, and Jungian analyst in private practice in the Chicago area. He's a member of the Chicago Society of Jungian Analysts and the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts. He's also on the editorial board of the Journal of Analytical Psychology, which some of you may know quite a bit about. He was the co-director of training of the analyst training program and co-director of the clinical training program in analytical psychotherapy at the Jung Institute of Chicago. He's published articles on thirdness, which I really look forward, hopefully get to talk about that. And I hope he's getting into the Charles Sanders Peirce stuff. The structure of analysis, alchemy, supervision, dreams, active imagination, and numerous reviews. He can be contacted and you'll see it there. Boris Matthews has graduated from the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago and maintains practice of analytical psychology in the Milwaukee and Madison, Wisconsin areas. He's particularly interested in working with persons who recognize a need to develop a balanced adaptation of the outside and the inside worlds. Work that involves awareness of the individual's psychological typology, dreams, active imagination, and spiritual concerns are integral elements in his analytic work. The ultimate goal of which is to develop a functioning dialogue with the non-ego center, the self. He serves as the director of training of the analyst training program, regularly teaches classes for analytic candidates, and conducts study groups in Madison, as well as by video conference. And then David has joined us, and this is the quick bio I could find on you, David. I hope this is a good one, and I know it's in first person. I'll flip it around for you. David is at the Getty, and he's been the rare books curator at the Getty Research Institute since 2002, before decamping from New York to LA. He was an adjunct professor at the NYU Classics Department and a resident expert at the H.P. Krauss. He came to this path by getting a PhD in classics and Arabic from Duke University, and notes and the irresistible urge to head straight back to New York the second that he finished his doctorate. It is my honor to welcome Dyane Sherwood. Here we are. Dyane Sherwood collaborated with the late Joseph L. Henderson, who's a doctor on a book relating the images of the Splendor Solis to the process of transformation and analysis. Dr. Henderson had his personal analysis with Dr. Jung and was the only American contributor to Jung's remarkable and very memorable book, Man and His Symbols. Dr. Sherwood is a Jungian analyst, sand play therapist, and author, and she founded the Analytical Psychology Press. So thank you so much. I am very, very much looking forward to getting into the transmutations of the evening. Thank you, Dyane. I hope you'll take it away from here.
Good evening, everyone. The illuminated manuscript of the Splendor Solis, dated 1582, is widely characterized as the most beautiful of all alchemical works. Yet the book, co-authored by Joseph Henderson and myself 20 years ago, remains the only in-depth attempt to study the 22 paintings in relation to a process of transformation of the human psyche or soul. 20 years on, having lived with these images, having worked with them, and they having worked on me, I feel a certain clarity of perspective. I hope to share some of this with you tonight. I'm going to start the slides now, and that'll take a moment. I want to pause here to acknowledge Joseph Henderson, my mentor and later my friend. As Will mentioned, Dr. Henderson had his analysis with Jung in the 1930s, before and during undergoing medical training in London. During that time, he discovered the Splendor Solis in the rare book room of the British Museum, where it was held at that time. In the 1950s, having settled in San Francisco, where he was one of the founders of the Jung Institute, he had color slides made of the paintings and used some of them when teaching analytic candidates. He wrote about the Splendor Solis images briefly and gave a lecture for the Archives for Research into Archetypal Symbolism that focused on the first 11 images. I offered to help him turn his lecture into a small book because I felt it would be of wider interest. And we included the dreams of some of my patients, as well as dreams of his patients and of his own dreams. At that time, Dr. Henderson encouraged me to expand the book, something I would not have ventured to do without his encouragement. It was an amazing gift to me because I knew he would not put his name to anything that did not meet his standard. And I had the greatest respect for his intellect, subtlety of feeling, and wisdom. Our book was published by Routledge just in time for Dr. Henderson's 100th birthday celebration. And you see Dr. Henderson speaking there with the late David Treson. And I was one of the people who gave little speeches at the birthday. So I would like to dedicate this lecture to Dr. Henderson's memory. In the book, we focused on the process of transformation in Jungian analysis of an individual. Tonight, I want to focus on an interpretation of its symbolic images that addresses the need for a change in cultural attitudes. Here, I've arranged the 22 images from the Splendor Solis into 3 groups. Often the first 4 are considered a separate group so that it would be an arrangement of 4, 7, 7, 4. I've included the first 11 together just simply based on their formal content. In terms of the formal content, there are clearly 3 sets of images. Certain scholars, let me just back up a little bit and mention that certain scholars have said that these images simply represent alchemical transformations and that they have nothing to do with psychology. I would agree with that if we're thinking of psychology in terms of cognitive behavioral psychology, but where adept psychology is speaking about human inner transformation, then I think it becomes more relevant. Of course, the alchemists were working with matter, but that doesn't mean that the outer work didn't also include inner transformation. Whenever we're challenged with a problem that's insoluble, we humans often work it out in projection, working with some creative process or matter. The contemporary Iranian philosopher Syed Hossein Nasr has pointed out the traditional sciences, such as alchemy, which can be compared to the celebration of a cosmic mass, become reduced to a chemistry in which the substances have lost all their sacramental character. In the process, the sciences of nature lost their symbolic intelligibility. Alchemy was outlawed by the Catholic Church, and so was practiced in secret or in places outside the direct control of the Church, such as Venice, Germany, and in Eastern Europe. Alchemists worked outside the prevailing religion and cultural zeitgeist. Paracelsus, who was a devoted Catholic, recognized this contradiction when he said, "I write like a pagan, though I'm a Catholic." The moral danger involved in the practice of alchemy may also help to explain why very few alchemical manuscripts have survived, and why many works like the Rosarium are known primarily from crude woodblock prints made during the 1500s. In order to disguise processes and ideas, the alchemists created texts that are maddening to read. Quoting from the Splendor Solis text, "Whosoever, therefore, will act wisely should search for the wisdom of the old philosophers, which is shown in the wit and artfulness of the manifold parables and roundabout sayings, thus hiding the proper operations and thus rendering their unriddling difficult." Let me again turn to Professor Nasser, who has written, "Alchemy is neither a premature chemistry nor a psychology in the modern sense, although both of these are to be found in alchemical writings. Alchemy is a symbolic science of natural forms based on the correspondence between different planes of reality and making use of mineral and metal symbolism to expound a spiritual science of the soul. For alchemy, nature is sacred, and the alchemist is the guardian of nature." I hope to show you that the Splendor Solis is a work of nuance and subtlety, but also of bold assertions that turned upside down culturally embedded church-approved attitudes. I want to bring your attention primarily to three interrelated and prescient themes found in the Splendor Solis. I call them prescient not because they predicted the cultural, political, and environmental crises we face today, but because at least some people living 500 years ago and more were quite aware of the need for change. Unfortunately, their message did not have an impact on the dominant culture. And I think you'll see that we have the same consciousness trying to be raised again in our own century and in the previous century. And again, the dominant culture does not seem to be attending to it. The first is an imperative to rediscover that a human being is a part of nature. To redeem ourselves, we need to get outside our conventional ways of thinking and experience ourselves as part of the world of nature and attempt to discover what is essential. As the alchemist says, to discover the nature of the four elements. Second, the paintings explicitly present a critique of certain fundamental values of Western culture. By this, I do not refer to the Greek philosophers and mathematicians, but rather to the Greek heroic ideal, as we'll see. Third, Greek culture devalued feminine qualities, as well as actual women, supplanting cultures that included the ancient goddesses and their connection to the world of nature and to the mysteries. My talk next month, which I'm quite excited about, will further develop this theme by looking at Ovid's myth of Arachne and bringing in historical, archaeological materials and reimagining the myth as if Arachne had written it. And this is my turning upside down the inheritance of one of the inheritances of Greek culture. My talk next month will further develop this theme. So I hope you'll, if you're interested, I hope you'll come next month too. Okay, so the paintings. They're highly sophisticated and their symbolism is complex. In fact, a study of them is a wonderful course in alchemical symbolism. And one can't do justice even in an hour to even one image. So I hope you'll bear with me as we look at some highlights. As I said, I've divided these paintings into 3 series. I believe that the first 11 illuminated paintings comprise a unique depiction of processes of embodied inner transformation, 400 years before Jung was born or the word psychoanalysis was used. Jung spent the final decades of his life studying alchemy, and in particular, the nature, the nature of the opposites, culminating in his great work, Mysterium Conjunctionis. He knew about the Splendor Solis from a black and white printed facsimile, but he never had access to the illuminated paintings. I wonder if he would have spent quite so long on the nature of the opposites, or if he would have recognized and perhaps been guided by the highly developed and sophisticated consciousness behind the Splendor Solis. Yet, Jung independently came to many of the same conclusions that I believe are conveyed in the Splendor Solis. I've also wondered why, in his study of the Rosarium Philosophorum, Jung stopped with the image of the hermaphrodite. Gus Cwik, who's a panelist this evening, has been speaking and writing about the remaining images, and we're very fortunate to have him with us this evening. So, looking at 2 images from the first series, these are the first and last images. In these paintings, we find well-known alchemical symbols, but they're within multidimensional spaces, indicating different realities that seem to interplay with one another. The sequence seems at times a narrative, but also a brilliant symbolic acrobatic performance. The meaning of a symbol is seemingly decomposed only to be synthesized and emerged with an enriched meaning. One thinks of deintegration and integration, analysis and synthesis, destruction and creation. I know of no other alchemical work that shows a comparable level of sophistication in its play of imagery, with symbols morphing in meaning and taking on richer associations as they appear in new contexts. The first slide, like an initial dream, lays out the problem and hints at a solution, while the last painting of the series shows, okay, so the first slide, like an initial dream, lays out the problem and hints at a solution, and we'll be looking at that in a few moments in more detail. While the last painting of the series shows that the alchemist clearly understands that it is his own substance that must now be transformed, and he is willing to submit to the ordeal. You see in that on the right-hand side, the alchemist is now in the vat, and his assistant, known as a puffer, is heating up the fire under the bath. And we also see a white bird at that represents spirit at his head. Is that a lighting, or is it rising from below? We might wonder. The 7 paintings of the astrological series are based on a popular theme of the Middle Ages where there were paintings of the planet ruler above and the earthly activities ruled by that planet down below. What makes the Splendor Solis series unique is that between heaven and earth, we see suspended there a niche, much like the paintings of the first series. In the niche is an alembic or a vessel containing symbolic figures. Here we witness the dynamics of a self-contained consciousness that sees clearly the archetypal situation represented by the planet ruler and the events below, and yet is also inwardly affected by it. In other words, I'm suggesting that the container of the alembic, which has a crown around it, indicating that it's the royal art of alchemy, and the inner figure I'm suggesting represents something about the nature of the situation when the witnessing of this scene evokes. Another panel member, Boris Matthews, has a particular interest in astrology and may help us to understand more fully this astrological point of view. We might ask further, what is the relationship of the vessel, and what might the inner state be when confronted with this particular reality? And I chose this image. This is under the sign of Mars, conflict. And we see in the base of the painting, there's a depiction of peasants revolting, and they're coming with their implements, but being suppressed by soldiers in knights' uniforms. And we see that out toward the countryside, there are people marauding and people rounding up cattle and peasants under the sign of Mars, whose chariot is pulled by two wolves. But the alembic in the center is a white three-headed bird that has gold crowns on it, on its heads, and its heads are looking out. There's the two heads on the side are looking from side to side, and it's balancing in this alembic in the most precarious way. But if you look at the shape of the body is in the shape of a heart. I can't think of a symbol that might represent better the way I feel with the current events that we're now witnessing, the helplessness, the immobility, the wanting to transcend. You see, it has wings, but it can't rise up. It's trapped and helpless and must witness this terrible scene. Now, through this series, in Jungian terms, we might think of this series as depicting a situation where the relationship between the ego and the self is such that we don't take so personally the situation in which we find ourselves. One recognizes that there are archetypal situations or fate or chance that have nothing to do with oneself, but larger forces in the universe and in history. Yet one is profoundly affected and changed by such forces. By containing the experience without impulsive reacting, which nowadays we'd say reflects a higher order of affect regulation, containing the affective discharge in the vessel, might a transformation take place? There's a play of opposites between above and below, inner and outer. But is there a causal relationship implied? Does the response to one situation perhaps synchronistically lead to another? I don't know, but I continue to contemplate these relationships. What I can say is that at certain times I can relate to one painting or another. I'm also reminded of the fallacy of believing that just because one thing follows another doesn't mean that progress is being made, or that there is a narrative to discover, and hence this eternal round of the planets reminds us of that. These are the final 4 paintings of the Splendor Solis. The visual complexity of the previous paintings falls away in the final 4 paintings. To me, they present a distillation that conveys a different quality of consciousness, of being, than is found in the previous images. It is something only clearly known when one has passed through the earlier states. Okay, I'm going to stop the slides for right now. I'm not speaking here of insight or intellect. The paintings clearly show that the process is a felt experience, and they do it through color, facial expression, body language, and through symbols. I wonder, what might they be trying to tell us? Could it be that, from the alchemist's point of view, so-called higher consciousness is not a state without emotion, but it can be attained only by not acting out of emotion, yet experiencing it fully and unflinchingly, despite the suffering that one must endure. This is contrasted to the ultimate goal of Buddhist practice, where enlightenment ends suffering and results in a sublime equanimity. The Alchemist's Journey brings to mind T.S. Eliot's words, "For liberation, not less of love, but expanding, of love beyond desire, and so liberation from the future as well as the past. Thus, love of a country begins as attachment to our own field of action and comes to find that action of little importance, though never indifferent. History may be servitude, history may be freedom. See, now they vanish, the faces and places, with the self which, as it could, loved them, to become renewed, transfigured in another pattern." Now, let's look at the symbolism of the first few paintings. Are you all with me? Okay. The very first painting depicts the coat of the arms of the art of alchemy, a disintegrating coat of arms that seems to fall into an alternate dimension. Henderson felt that this series was like the analysis of personal complexes, where you never know what is going to happen next. So now we're going to go back to the slideshow. We see here a central scene surrounded by a frame of plants and animals. Such a frame is typical of illuminated manuscripts of the time, but the frames themselves in this manuscript may also suggest a different reality or consciousness in the natural world. Here we see animals acting in more human ways, playing an instrument and offering food to another species. What might this imply? That we are not so different? Or is this symbolic of an aspect of an alchemical transformation, where one substance symbolically feeds another? The making of music reminds us of the importance for alchemists of performing operations in harmony with the astrological situation, as well as their belief that the movement of the planets created sounds, which they refer to as the harmony of the spheres. The title, "The Arms of the Art," artists, sets out the problem. We see a coat of arms, something originally granted by a ruler in recognition of the bravery of a knight. It was then passed down from father to son. But the coat of arms of alchemy is shown in multiple dimensions and is coming apart. It shows a state of deconstruction. It doesn't hold together. What might that mean? The paradox is obvious. The old order is coming apart. We also see two men in conversation with turbulent waters in the canal. Perhaps they are asking, how might this problem be solved? Let's look at the problem more closely. We see that here is a sun within which there are three faces that look disturbed. What could be a better representation of a very disturbed and fragmented consciousness? The steady sun, which does not appear to be falling off the banner, gives us a very different feeling. The knight's armor includes a golden crown that is surmounted by three crescent moons. And those look black, and that's because the silver is tarnished. They used real silver in the painting. The golden crown, a symbol of wholeness and higher consciousness, or the ruling principle, here refers to the royal art of alchemy. The three crescent moons are entirely out of place in a heraldic banner, not to mention in their location above the golden crown. They refer, of course, to the feminine in Western culture. Why three moons? This traditionally refers to the goddess or the triune goddesses, or to the three stages of womanhood. You'll recall from Jung's discussion of the axiom of Maria in Psychology of the Transference that the number three in Pythagorean number theory is a masculine number. So here our expectations are challenged because it is associated with the feminine. And they hold a place above the golden crown, not inferior to it. Might this new crown represent a consciousness that integrates both masculine and feminine in its awareness? And so I see this as possibly a hint at the solution to this problem, as the patriarchal knightly knighthood, chivalrous even way of doing things is no longer working. So we're shown both the problem in the image of the lower sun and possibly the solution, but not so fast. It's easier said than done. Let's go on to the next painting. The answer shown in subsequent paintings. It will be necessary to leave the accepted structures of life and attempt to discover the fundamentals of the natural world to which humans belong. The banner reads, "We seek the nature of the four elements." The alchemist is setting off on a journey that symbolically is represented by his actually going into nature and carrying an alembic and pointing to that place in the alembic where there begins to be a vapor hitting the side of the alembic. So seeking the nature of the four elements of the Greeks, is something much deeper than simply going out into nature to rediscover nature by going to the beach or something like that. This is a much more profound and serious, and you notice, very focused thing. This is done with great intention. The church suppressed pagan religions which were connected to nature and an experience of the sacred in the natural world. The church also devalued women and suppressed goddess worship, a practice that desacralized feminine qualities of relatedness, nurturing, a connection to a particular place on the earth, and qualities of tenderness, relatedness, compassion, and the valuing of plants, animals, and natural forces as sources of knowledge and wisdom. These links were entirely severed for Americans who were immigrants and had no culturally unconscious connections to place. This made it easy to identify as a conqueror and exploiter, much as the ancient Greeks did when they conquered other lands. Referring again to the contemporary Iranian philosopher Syed Hossein Nasr, he wrote, "The translation of Arabic works into Latin, which caused a major intellectual change from the 11th to the 13th centuries, resulted gradually in the Aristotelianization of Christian theology based on illumination, and the contemplative view of nature was increasingly pushed aside as the Gnostic and metaphysical dimension of Christianity became ever more stifled in an increasingly rationalistic environment." Also, I'm reminded here of Richard Tarnas as saying that, when Constantine converted to Christianity, the Romans became Christian, but maybe more importantly, the church became Roman. I want to point out here that if you look at this frame now, you see that the two deer are looking up at the painting of the alchemist, as if nature, something in nature itself, is aware now of this return to discover what nature's really about, the fundamentals. So here's our third painting. The self-discipline and ability to make discriminations, symbolized by the knight with his sword and focused stance, is not to be discarded. However, these developments, we would say ego developments, are now in the service of making a distinction between two opposites or complements, sulfur associated with the masculine principle and Mercury associated with the feminine. The two fountains flow over and into a natural setting. Here their potential is lost. They return to nature. Across the knight's breast, we see the famous color sequence of alchemy: black, white, yellow, red. The art of alchemy is required to bring the skill to these two substances in order to create mercuric sulfide or cinnabar. And these colors are observed during that process. We see also the 7 gold and silver stars above his head, which are the 7 planets and also the number of initiation. According to the text of the Splendor Solis, art goes quite another way to work and with different intention from nature. Therefore, does art also use different tools and instruments? But it then goes on to say something that was a complete anathema to the Catholic Church. The form of everything, be it living, growing, or metallic, comes into existence by virtue of the interior force in matter, except the human soul. And of course, the Church argued that God created everything and that nothing could be, nature could not create nature in some way of itself. The inscription on this is quite interesting and full of paradoxes. And even translating from the Latin, I found when I was translating it that there are things in the Latin that could be read 2 ways. But here's my best translation. From 2 waters make one, whereupon seek to make the sun and moon, and prepare to drink the wine of the antagonists, and you shall see with the dead. Thereupon make watery earth and multiply the stone. Here are the alchemical colors that you find used symbolically throughout alchemy. So let's go on to the 4th painting, which we're going to look at in some detail. This is the well-known alchemical theme of the king and the queen, but I know of no other image of the queen and king like this one. Here, the queen looks serene while the king is anxious. It seems to me that this portrays the situation where the feminine has reclaimed her natural strength. This is disconcerting for the king, to say the least. But note that she is not trying to dominate him. She is not using power. Rather, her gesture is calm, unthreatening. There is an inscription above and below this picture, and the upper inscription says the particular, and the lower one says the universal way with the particular included. And I think this, I must, even though this is a cultural lecture, I must say I can't think of anything that describes individuation better. That there's a paradox that when one becomes more one's idiosyncratic self, you also feel more connected with all of creation, rather than feeling isolated. So, continuing with this image, we see that the king and queen are meeting in a natural setting outside the court with its many rituals and prescriptions for behavior, outside of their carefully scripted roles. The queen is standing on an orb, while the king is standing on a fire. The orb may be the earth or perhaps the moon, as it is in the Rosarian image. Just to compare it with the Rosarian image, you see that on the right. The ideal of royalty can represent the archetypal ruler, who is at the top of the hierarchy in a society, the final arbiter of disputes, and the crown is a symbol of his kingship. The queen can refer to the feminine principle of relatedness, while the king refers to the masculine principle of logos. Both of these live within the psyches of both men and women, and even modern Americans have dreams in which a king or queen appear. Illustrations, if we think about it, usually depict the queen and king on their thrones at banquets and processions, holding forth at court with their attendants. They are not important primarily as individuals, but for what they represent. However, as I pointed out, the king and queen can no longer rely on this as they meet out in nature. Here we might think about what it is like when a culture meets an opposite culture or a culture with different values, and they're not surrounded by their usual trappings. Might it be a different kind of meeting? We see here too something very impressive that is so different from the other images of the king and queen with which I'm familiar, which are mainly the woodblock prints, because you see how beautifully the affect is portrayed in gesture and in facial expression. Here's a close-up so you can see that a little more clearly. And you see even the sun and the moon have their own expressions. The moon seems to be looking down at the king, while the sun seems to be looking over at the moon. And here's something quite interesting, which is here the moon is shining by her own light. She's not a reflection of the sun. Now I want to show you an interesting coincidence. You saw in an earlier slide that the king is standing on a fire that looks as if it might have eyes. Here's what the king and queen are standing on. And I happen to be preparing for something else and looking at the vision seminars. And I saw this painting in the vision seminars. And on the painting was written this text: I beheld a face closed, and I besought the face, oh, open your eyes unto me so that I may behold them. And the face became very dark, and slowly the eyes opened. I beheld what no man is meant to see, so full of woe and beauty that I cried out. I could bear it no longer, and the eyes closed. I don't know what this was meant to be. but it does look almost like some wild and fiery and primitive creature there at the feet of the king, that he's in all of his kingly power. He's trying to, I don't know, maybe he's either stepping on it or trying to suppress it, maybe. We could project a lot of things onto this. I wanted to tell you that, like, when we think of the background of the European alchemy, it's, of course, came from Islamic alchemy, which was much more sophisticated in many ways than European alchemy, because their civilization had been thriving. And it wasn't the same fundamentalist kind of Islamic beliefs that we hear about today. In medieval Islamic culture, the alchemist's relationship to the feminine was not only a kind of archetypal relationship, but it was also manifested in real collaboration and exchanges between men and women. And this goes all the way back in time. And this is actually portraying Zosimos, who was in the 3rd century. And but these are illustrations now of Zosimos and his talking and standing next to an oven with Theosebia. This illustration is one of my very favorites. It's from the 1400s, and it's an illustration of a very famous, much earlier poem by the great poet Nizami. And in this, some alchemists are having a dispute, and they go to settle to see a woman alchemist who's sitting up in her window. Her name is Miriam, and they are going to ask her to help them to settle their dispute. So she's clearly a figure of wisdom and reverence. And we see in her courtyard, there's a tree, and at the base of the tree, there are flowers, so that it is blooming near the earth. Now, in this, just to add a little humor and show you that the alchemists had a great sense of humor, some of them, the little streamers that the king and queen are carrying, hers says milk of the virgin, and they're in Latin, and his is coagulate the masculine. Now, these are related to famous alchemical sayings, solve, dissolve, and coagulate, dissolve and coagulate. But I want to show you the illustrations. The milk of the virgin was like a white substance, a white liquid, and it could be different ones. But here are some illustrations. So here's one of virgin's milk, with the 2 alchemists nursing at her breast while she's crowned, and her face and hair are extremely red. And here's another one, quite different, of virgin's milk. She's got a lot of milk to give there, and in fact, it's flooding along with the beast that she's sitting on. You've got to wonder about a little ambivalence there. So the king and queen here are on a base now. We're now moving into 3 dimensions. And this base is very important. It shows the cultural background against which the king and queen are meeting. And this base is a critique of Greek heroic ideals. The picture on the left shows, and it's thoughtfully labeled for us by its creator. It's the famous battle between Hector and Achilles at the Siege of Troy. Now, you may be familiar with the story. Achilles was the son of a sea nymph, Thetis. And Thetis wanted to protect him from mortal danger. And so she held him by his ankles and did a something so that that he would be, his whole body would be bathed, but she was holding it by his ankles. And so it turned out that he could only be killed by a wound to his ankle. And he was a most celebrated warrior of the Greeks. He was brave, but he was arrogant and spoiled and impetuous and lusty, and traded women around, which they all did. And he was upset. He got upset because somebody that he'd taken as a spoil, somebody else claimed him, and he had to take him back from his friend, this woman back from his friend he'd given him to. And he was really mad about the whole business. Like, it just irked him. And so he left the field of battle. He was and sulked off and took all of his great warriors with him. And in the meantime, the Greeks started having a lot of trouble in the battle and doing badly. So somebody went and they begged him to come back. Please come back and help us. Things are falling apart up there. And he was still so sulking about this whole thing that he sent his very dear, dear friend, Patroclus. And he said, wear my armor and lead my men into battle. I just can't go back yet. So Patroclus goes, and he ends up being killed. And Hector, the great Trojan warrior, was the one who actually didn't fell him, but took the final blow. So Achilles, enraged, is going to go back and kill Hector. Now, his mother warns him not to do it, that it will lead to his death. But he doesn't pay attention to that. He's full of passion. And he goes, and indeed he kills Hector. And he drags Hector's body back and forth to disgrace his body and to humiliate people. And this was really against their idea of what was honorable. And of course, Achilles then ended up being killed. And he asked that his bones be mixed with those of Patroclus, which they were. And the place where they were buried was later visited by Alexander the Great. So here we have this warrior hero, this ideal. The large center part of the frieze shows the story of Alexander the Great and the basilisk. And so Alexander is shown across from a city. And in this story, this shows a kind of middle way of the Greeks, because what happens is that his men and horses inexplicably start dropping dead, and they can't figure out what's going on. And then someone sees a basilisk sitting across the river on the wall of the city that they are presumably hoping to conquer. And someone says, oh, it's a basilisk. You can't look at that or you'll be killed. It kills with its gaze. And so instead of rushing impetuously to kill that basilisk, they have a discussion about what to do. And they come up with the idea of using mirrors so that the basilisk will be killed by its own gaze. So here we have Alexander, who's still very much in this Greek heroic conquering mode. But he also pays attention to philosophy and solves problems, and of course brings learning, doesn't just take the spoils, but brings so-called Greek civilization or Greek civilization and really the classics to other parts of the world. Here's a close-up of the basilisk on the wall, and on the right is a picture by Dürer of a basilisk, so you can see that resemblance a little more easily and clearly. This monstrous figure. Now, the third one is Alexander again. And this is a picture of the famous meeting of Alexander and the philosopher, the Stoic, Diogenes. And Diogenes, this took place at the Scythian Games, and Diogenes went there and was staying in a barrel. And Alexander heard that he was there, and he came to greet Diogenes and offered him a boon, which Alexander liked to do. So he offered Diogenes a boon, said, here I am, Alexander, what can I do for you? And Diogenes said, you're standing in the way of the sun, would you please move? And that was the boon he wanted. Now, and then Alexander said, if I were not Alexander, I would be Diogenes. I can't imagine a meeting of two more opposite people. And here they are. And here we have the kind of idea of the shadow in Jungian terms, the opposite. And if you weren't one thing, you might be the opposite. So here's a different kind of meeting of the opposites taking place at the base of this image of the king and queen. Now, an interesting thing about Diogenes is that he was a worshiper of Sibyl. The Greeks called her mountain mother. She was the goddess of the earth's fertility, of caverns and mountains, nature and wild animals. And so here we have this Stoic who's also a worshiper of the great mother goddess. As the rest of what I wanted to present continues to show images that develop more and more about the relationship between the opposites, and in particular about the relationship to the natural world and a redemption of the feminine principle. And just to, what I would add to this is that Marie-Louise von Franz, in her very last lecture, wrote that she thought Jung's most important contribution was the redemption of the feminine principle of relatedness. So I'll leave you there just to bring us back to Jung. And thank you for your patience.
Oh, thank you so much, Dyane. I'm treasured not only by your knowledge of the manuscript, but your passion for it. And so that we have the opportunity, I would love to hear from David, Gus, Dennis, Boris, everybody. I'd love to open it up, and what are your thoughts about the universal and the particular? I mean, it's such a resonant theme with the Tao and everything with Jung. Go for it.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, Dyane. I'm always astounded by these plates. So used to looking at the rosarium and the woodcuts, the astounding beauty and articulation of these plates is always amazing. I was glad you put that rosarium, kind of the king and the queen in there. That's my series. Sleep with those plates under my pillow every night so that they come up and impact me. One of the things that in my work to expand what you're talking about in the masculine and the feminine, really, and culturally thinking about the solar qualities really being stability, permanence, unchangeability. Mm-hmm. Being challenged by the lunar qualities in terms of the unstable, disorder, ever-changing, impermanence. I think kind of one of the things about the popularity of Buddhism now is that idea of the impermanence. And kind of struck by your opening comments of really, you know, about the redemption of the feminine. We're talking about the 1500s, and look at how much have we progressed actually since the 1500s of trying to raise this, I would say, lunar principle. I think the solar quality kind of is just fighting back, you know, wanting to keep things the way it is and unchanging. And we're really sort of changing, you know, facing a changing world and a different world kind of, you know, around that. So I think that kind of, you know, adds another layer, kind of general layer to the particular that you're also focusing on. I was kind of wondering, kind of, Anne being a woman, you know, what is the tenacity of, you know, why this is an ever ongoing process of trying to lift the lunar qualities and the feminine into consciousness?
You know, I think that we have to be really careful not to mix up, though, or to conflate, Gus, and I'm sure you wouldn't, solar consciousness with patriarchal consciousness.
Yeah, and you think it's really the power that it fuels more the patriarchy of the not wanting to let go of this kind of ordered system. Thank you.
If I may, I might mention that I think there's a difference between the sun and the sun at noon, right? The sun that doesn't want to fall, the sun at the top, at the apex, resisting any descent. So I think that when we talk about the sun and moon, the meaning varies based on the station.
I'm kind of surprised if you're talking about male and female, especially alchemical playfulness about the ambiguity, why not look at the images of hermaphrodites that are prevalent through, you know, it's at its simplest chemical formula, it's mercury amalgam gilding, that, you know, Aphrodite is copper and Hermes is mercury. And in fact, the 7 planets are 7 metals. You know, that's why you also get 7 stars that are gold and silver. Couple of things. I loved your talk. Thank you very much, Dyane. And I guess, as you know, I did an Art of Alchemy exhibition at the Getty, and then Jörg Vollnagel and I reiterated it in Berlin with a lot more objects, because there are a lot more objects in Berlin. One thing, I mean, so maybe in the time of Bacon, the 13th century, there's Magnus. The church bans alchemy for a little while because the debate is alchemy the art that replicates nature, or does alchemy perfect nature? And the idea that God doesn't let nature be generative, I totally disagree with, because the whole idea is that he has imbued all matter with animation. All matter has soul, and that's the whole idea, both in natural philosophy, that it's transformation of the self towards perfection, rubedo, and transformation of matter. The thing for alchemists is that it takes nature 1 million years for mercury and sulfur to combine into vermilion. But in Alchemy 101, so the first thing you teach your students is you can make artificial cinnabar in a couple of hours. Also, I guess I was saying maybe the church, for a while, there are periods where alchemy is banned, but I mean, Lorenzo de' Medici becomes Pope Leo X, is a huge supporter of alchemy and Hermetica. And I don't want to go on too long. There's just one thing that I always think of in one of the images you showed in the border, where you show it's a simian, it's an ape, and then an ibis that he's feeding.
Yeah.
And then you have an ape playing music. And El Jahiz in the 19th century, an African Islamic natural philosopher, which is like what I think alchemists consider themselves. It was a mainstream science. El-Jahiz and Kitab al-Hayawan, the Book of Living Beings, basically proposes a theory of evolution, that the creature that is more of its species, that's more intelligent and adaptable to its environment, will evolve, will become more sensible, will become more intellectual. And in Islam, the stages are from ape to human to prophet to angel. You can't become God, but you can be sublimated into God. And you show this image that the Splendor Solis shows this image that has an ape feeding an ibis, which is the Egyptian god Thoth, god of the scribes, god
Of alchemy.
written record. And then after that, the ape is playing guitar. You know, it's learned music, it's learned art, which I think is a huge part of the Splendor Solis. A lot of what's infused in it are the basis of color theories, the basis of matter theory. And I don't think it's an alchemist in the tub. I think it's you're using the human as a metaphor for matter, because humans are the matter in the physical world that we know have soul. So for the alchemist, the human, especially in an alembic, is a microcosm of this idea of how does God create? How does God let nature create? And how do you replicate that? I don't want to go on. I'll put in the link, an unabashed self-promotional link that I'm giving a talk on alchemy next week at Philosophical Research Society, that based on yours and my exhibition. So I'll stick that in. Thanks.
Could you
I'll
put
the
that
link
in the chat
Yep.
or something so that we could get a link to it?
Yep.
Thank you.
Yes, and that also at the end of the presentation, I will put out the information about your talk, David, next week at PRS.
Good.
You know, but I'm so glad that you came in today just on such short notice, and that your dog is still around and has challenged the coyotes.
He's been listening intently the whole time, especially when you show peacocks. He likes chasing them at Hollywood Forever.
I'd like to jump in here for just a moment and pick up the King Queen theme again and link that to astrology. As we know, in any astrology chart going back as far as there are astrology charts, both the sun and the moon appear. And we also know that historically, the more official, at least Western Occidental official point of view was that the twain meet in bed, but not psychologically otherwise, or something like that. What I think you're pointing out, Dyane, is supported then actually by a more contemporary reading of astrology. That is, that every birth chart, every chart has both a sun and moon. And so the challenge really, which is also the alchemical challenge that you're pointing to, is not only to live one sun, but it is to live both the sun and the moon as a blend. They have to be taken together to make a full functional human being. The second point I would make is one of your wonderful footnotes in the book, where you reference a passage from John Beebe's Integrity in Depth. And John there is quoting Howard Teich, an unpublished manuscript, where Howard is talking about the sun-moon blend, or the masculine-feminine balance within each individual. Okay, and I think that's what you're pointing out here in this series, but also what is a huge contemporary challenge. Well, our colleague Robert Moore actually was working on that, decades ago. So thank you for bringing this and bringing me back to read the book again.
You know, I also might mention that Howard Teich, as you mentioned, happens to be here. And, if he's willing, we could pop him into the screen. We have a spare slot out there. I would love to do a follow-up on this particular topic. I don't know whether I could push Dyane into December, but, I think it's clear that the audience is out there for this material. And as I was talking with Boris at the very beginning of this, I think it is a testament to the community of myth and scholars as a whole that we can generate an audience like this about a 16th century manuscript. That's even difficult. I've never seen the initial one, the original one, and there are several different versions, but the Harley manuscript that's in the British Library, I mean, the closest I can get to it is Ford's book, this one. I mean, this thing is just, it's a work of art. I mean, they're beautiful, and they're about this size. This is pretty much the size of the illuminations. They're about 8
That's
by
larger. That's larger than the originals.
They're a little larger. Yes, you're absolutely right. The originals are about 8 by 12, something like that, and that's slightly larger than that. But what interest? I mean, doesn't it, with all of the media, the modernness, and the contemporary tech stuff that's going on in our world, that a bunch of us would spend an afternoon with you, Dyane. So we should have another conversation, and maybe we don't have to wait so long about that. Hello, Howard.
This is one of the biggest honors of my life to spontaneously be here, because Joe Henderson was my first analyst. And I got the honor of seeing him for 5 years. And there's so many experiences, but the one I had called him up because I was really hurting and I was studying alchemy and Jung. And I got to the point where I saw he was the resident alchemist. So I called him up and said, "Can I study alchemy with you?" He said, "I don't teach it." So about 5 or 6 months later, I desperately called him up. "Can I go into therapy with you?" I had to beg him, but he saw me. And at that moment, I went to his office and told him a dream. He pulled the Splendor Solis out of his shelf and he points one of the plates. And at that moment, I knew it was an experience that you could not get intellectually. And to hear you, who I've admired from a distance, and to see Joe's picture and have Dana and Will, who are just amazing people in my life, who introduced me to Clay, who's one of the members of this community, has just changed my life. And to hear this come up spontaneously tonight, I cannot tell you what an honor it is to be recognized by this illustrious group. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Howard. And you have certainly brought your share of scholarship into it. But we have to thank Boris then for the synchronicity of you bringing you in the first place. Because to me, these synchronicities point out the validity of what we call the web of life.
Right on.
And you just can't really plan on these things happening. They happen. And if you're fortunate enough to recognize when they happen, you take advantage of them. So I'm looking and I saw you, I check out who's in here and I'm going, well, Howard, you're here.
Can I grab one more thing? So I had many of the best San Francisco analysts, including Joan Chodorow, which for those of you who know her, she is so magical. But my next major analyst was John Beebe. And here I'm in the middle of analysis with him. And John, I don't know, he's just been many years. And first of all, he introduces me to Rick Tarnas. All of a sudden, he says, he told Rick about the solar lunar male and that stuff. And so all of a sudden, I'm having dinner with he and Rick, and they're talking about astrology. What am I doing there? What am I really doing there? And then many years later, when I wrote my book, and many years it took me with many editors, I wrote Rick and asked him, he put the most powerful comment I've ever heard said about the integrity of this material, that you're all so deeply involved in it. It's just like an ultimate honor to be with the alchemist of the alchemy tradition at the level of authenticity, and to spontaneously have this happen. That is, I'd like to say, the male triple masculine for men is one of the more important resources that is coming alive with some of us. I know in this group, but period. Let me just be quiet and thank you for the tremendous honor.
Thank you, Howard. Thank you very much. Gus, when we were talking earlier through emails, we talked about solar lunar when I saw your lunar article on your website, which I'd still like to read or see it. But in any event, who we haven't heard from Dennis.
You guys are fast and loose, and I'm about 200 yards behind you. So I thank you, Dyane. Just listening to you helps so much. Myself and others like me who are really getting their feet wet in this alchemical tradition for the first time. So I'm watching the clock here, and I'll be brief, but what excited me when I saw the images is I asked myself, how do I approach these? And before I read your essay, Dyane, and other material, I thought, well, let's pay attention to the aesthetic encounter with each of these, not knowing so much of the mythology that was surrounding them. So let me tell you what I did. I asked myself, what is it that I'm gazing at in each of the images? And what ways are they effectively informing me?
Yes.
So I set up a ritual. I get up at 4:30, 7 days a week, so I'm kind of familiar and love the moon as much as does Dana. And I decided set up a ritual. So every morning I lit a candle. I do that all the time, but especially for these images. I put on Gregorian chant music, and I just have one light on, and I started to look at the images. I also found that this small ritual action made me more porous and more open to each of these images, which I was treating as poems. And the poetics of these images, it's just magnificent.
Yes.
Having recently been involved intensely with Melville's Moby Dick and nature's presence.
Yeah.
As a colleague, Willow Young, who grew up on Nantucket Island, led afternoon sessions, and I was teaching Moby Dick in the morning. And then we took walks in nature on Nantucket Island. And so these walking meditations through nature were almost preparatory to tonight and to the images that you sent earlier. And so I asked myself, what interplay was being dramatized in each of these images between human nature, the natural order, and the divine natures, all of which Melville is interrogating beautifully in his epic, all of which were intermingling to form a new, and now I believe, a coherent world, even a coherent worldview. So after reading the descriptions under each of the first 8 images, then looking at the image, I stopped reading. I stopped reading the description and looked exclusively and tried to imagine my way into the image without being preformed or preset by the script. I began to follow the sun and moon images, beginning my gaze at the top and then descended. I thought to continue this way of entering each rich image from top to bottom. So each allowed me a descent to the Earth's surface. And I'm just going to read a couple more. I have 2.5 pages typed here of my, I'm going to call it my methodology, because
Wonderful.
I was free floating. And I thought, I've got to ground myself somewhere without literalizing too quickly, if at all, what the images were about. And so I'm just going to read a couple of other things. I tried to let the image unfold by gazing at it in its specificity. And I asked, what is the atmosphere of the painting or the setting? The action taking place, or has something already taken place and the residue of it is now the image?
Mm-hmm.
What is the story being depicted? And I'm also remembering your remark, some of these may not have a story. They may be an image, and they may be kind of autonomous. Did I see a connection between the intensity of the main plot when I felt there was a story and the social or communal setting of the plots that surrounded it? Within some sequences, like the flask that appears in 14 and following, is there a continuous story with each image a moment in the dramatic narrative? So I should be seeing them as something both particular and unifying in design. And then I went on and on. But what that did for me is it gave me a toehold without having the history that so many of you have in this field. And the experience was enriched each time I went through them, which I did 4 different times. And then tonight's comments from all of you have just amplified that even further. So that was my approach, to try to understand the aesthetic impact on me. So thank you.
That's fabulous, fabulous. And we also might also think of the idea of beauty, how important that these are so beautiful and that it's drawn us to these images. Yeah. David.
Thank you.
No, we've talked a lot about gender and we're talking about narrative, and we have 2 women on panelists. So if you don't mind, Sophie, I don't want to put you on the spot, but as a graphic artist who deals with visual narrative, I'd like to hear what you think about this stuff.
Well, thank you, David. And thank you, Dyane, for the presentation. I actually was drawn to what you talked about in the first plate where you shown the triple eagle, the white bird and the alembic, and sort of the conflict that's seen going around. And I felt like this is the one plate where you talked about it and you felt the emotion of it. You were talking about how the bird was feeling. And in my own images, the ones that I associate with this particular plate is kind of relates to the difficulty of changing. So that there's like this forward movement and the opposite, the resistance to this movement. So there is really that moment in the transformation that where you're really conflicted with it. You don't want to change. And something also that just occurred to me was that part of this change, part of what was associated for me in those drawings was the concept of memory, because when you change, there's something that you don't want to let go of. And I think something particular about, if we're talking about humans versus nature, I mean, nature kind of cleans itself out, disappears. And I think it was you, David, you mentioned like the white bird was like the symbol of purification. And that is sort of like the fear of losing the memory. And it kind of resonates with what we're going, I think the conflict we're going through right now in this big change is like, what are we losing, from before? And I think that man's particularity is that we accumulate the history. while nature kind of recycles, cleans, putrefies, and there's nothing left, it just changes. It doesn't remember what was in the past. It always moves forward. But it is us humans who want to hang on to things.
Actually, I was, when you showed via universalis particularibus, etc. I mean, essentially, it particularly is, it's plural. It's like particular things, individual things. And actually, the next exhibition I'm probably going to work on is art of memory, and this idea of like, how do you take fragmented flashes of the mind and interrelate them in some kind of narrative space to, you know, create a narrative of history or a consigned thing. Well, history is sad. A voice becomes a memory fades into history or just oblivion. And how do you take the particularia and like weave, whether it's a myth or true memory of history? I mean, and that's what art of memory always taught. But I'd like to approach it from more of a global, non-Western point of view, which we had tried with the alchemy exhibition. It ain't easy, you know. It's everything.
That's great.
But that I'd love that you brought up memory.
Yeah, that seems like something we don't think about, but it's yeah, it's definitely related to men.
It's a huge thing in rare books on alchemy, of the layout, the graphic layout of all these allegorical icon symbols, of how they're both sort of chemical formulas, but like Dyane was talking about, inner transformation, you know, perfection of the soul, reaching the sublime. And they're very influenced by memory books coming out of Islam and into the Renaissance. So I love that's my favorite stuff.
Yeah. I wonder if I could say something to Dennis. Dennis, when Joe Henderson and I finished writing the book, we taught a seminar for the advanced candidates at the Jung Institute, and I printed out a copy of one image a month and gave it to them and said, live with this, knowing nothing about it.
Yeah.
And come back next month.
Yeah.
And I love what you did. These images are so rich, and the symbols have so many associations and interpretations. So tonight you just got one person's slice of something where I focused on certain things to bring out a point. But I do want to emphasize how incredibly sophisticated and fascinating these are, and how we're drawn into them because of their beauty. And David, thank you so much. I would love to learn a lot from you, because I'm not I want your job. I want to do what you do. I wish if I could grow up again and do something, I'd do what you do, because I love these manuscripts, and I only wish I knew Arabic. And I would love to could you possibly find for us an earlier Arabic language version of the Splendor Solis? I know it must be there somewhere.
I don't know about that, but it you know, the Emerald Tablet is never written in Greek. It's in Arabic.
Yeah.
That comes out later. All of our alchemy collection is online. It's all digitized and online, and you won't learn it from me. You learn it from yeah. And you're right. I won't grow up, and you can't have my job. But it's you know, it's the books that know. You know, not me. So, and all of it is there. You know, it's great. You know, look at
the metaphor of getting it all online. You know, it's all about freeing alchemy, all about, in some ways, transmuting and freeing the spirit from the matter, bringing the matter into perfection of the spirit. And then how now these are these immaterial presentations of these texts. You know, I'm struck by some comments here where people are really meditating on just the power of the image. This is some of the stuff you guys are saying as well. The power of the images, just their immediate poetic meaning, And I just want to recognize a couple of these comments from Craig and Susan, engaging that. And that's something that I'm especially into as well. I'm in a symbolism unit with all of my young storytellers, screenwriters, filmmakers, actors, dancers. I keep saying to them, like, don't get locked. I see a door is a door, right? A shadow is a shadow, right? And so I think that that's this consciousness, this modality of consciousness that, Eliade kind of argues it comes before the spoken word, this kind of dreamlike consciousness, this image-driven consciousness. I don't need a word for snake before I've got a million associations that come up when I see a snake. It's already a living word, and it exists in my dream that way. So one of the things I just want to acknowledge and appreciate is how much you've helped us engage a modality of consciousness that is incredibly rich and valuable to all of us, and sometimes hard to penetrate and enter into in our modern world.
The one thing that occurs to me, and I don't know a better way to do it, but when I finish with the video that we'll make from here, and it'll be a few days, I'll make a title frame that will have the links to the Getty and the Getty website that David has just put in the chat, as well as the various Splendor Solis websites where you can get these resources. Since this really is only going to be available through a video, you'll have to kind of pause your computer and write them down or copy them and paste them, unless somebody else has got a better way to do it. I'm really struck by the quality of scholarship that we've brought into this particular myth salon, and Gus and Boris, I really thank you guys, for supporting Dyane, and David for being responsive to it, and Howard for just being spontaneous enough to say, wait a minute, I heard my name mentioned. This is really cool, and Sophie, as always. Sophie was one of my original choices to be a part of this thing. And look at the quality of the people that we are surrounding ourselves with. And I think it really points to the fact that when you get the right group of people, and there's a lot of vociferous interchange, good stuff really comes out. And I just, again, Boris and Gus, I want to see more of you. I hope you'll come back and play with us. And I hope, Gus, when I talk to you about the solar lunar idea that I've worked with Howard on other projects, that we can get a myth salon on solar lunar, and do lunar masculine. We just came off of a full moon, which I respond to all of this stuff. This gets in my juices. I'm weird for the last week. And now that we've had the full moon, I'm okay. But I have learned to navigate around a context that if I had it to do, would I be predictable and silence that part of me? Probably not. It's just part of who I am. So I think this is a good place for us to bring it to a close at 7 o'clock and get everybody out of here on time. Will, do you have any last minutes thoughts that you'd like to share? And then.
Well, I'm afraid I might be skipping, so I don't want to walk right into that one. That's, of course, being at the studio's internet. But I just want to make sure everybody knows we're going to be back and continuing this conversation. There are like Dennis, who has pages of notes. There are tons of stuff I want to talk about. The stuff we talked about with Achilles, talk about the proto-Achilles, and there are a million things that I think all of us have to keep going in this conversation, more than we can fit in these two. And hopefully y'all will go see David's talk at the Philosophical Research Society and just steep yourself in this stuff. But yeah, all I want to say is, come on back and let's keep at it.
Excellent. And I will be there to see David. I haven't been there since COVID. They've been quiet like most of us, and we're just finding now that we can maybe with caution congregate with one another. On that note, let's go out in a little moment of silence, go forward, Be brave, be safe. I love you all. Good night, everyone. Thank you all very much.
Good night,
Good
everybody.
night. Thank you, Dyane.
Thank you, Dyane.
Thank you all. It was a rich evening.
Very.
Good night. Thank you, Diane.
That's
Good
the
night,
real goal.
everybody.
Thank you for the honor of knowing you all.
Thanks, Howard.